This is the newest model from one of America's newest luxury brands. It's the 2026 Polestar 4, and at least for the moment, it replaces the Polestar 2 as the least expensive model in their lineup in the US. It's a wicked fast, almost sedan that's definitely very style-forward, but to my mind, doesn't actually make that much sense in America. Let's talk about why and see if you agree or if maybe I'm the crazy one. And I'll apologize in advance if I start losing my voice because I am getting over a cold, but we're just going to push through and talk about this over 500 horsepower liftback SUV, whatever it is you want to call it. I think we need to start with a history lesson. If you've heard this before, go ahead and use that table of contents to skip ahead, but it's essential to understand where Polestar came from and where they're going. Polestar started as a Volvo tuning company. They were not owned by Volvo, they just tuned Volvos for extra performance. Then Volvo thought, hey, we need an AMG, we need an M like BMW and Mercedes. So they bought Polestar to turn them into a performance division. That didn't really make a lot of sense for Volvo's mission though, and their safety obsession, so Polestar was ultimately spun off, but half owned by Volvo and half owned by Volvo's largest shareholder, Geely. Since then, Volvo has sold most of their stake, but they still retain an 18% ownership in Polestar, and Polestar is technically a public company traded in Europe. Polestar's lineup started with the S90 Coupe. That's basically what the Polestar 1 was. It was a plug-in hybrid, shared a lot with other Volvo models, and it looked exactly like an S90 Coupe. We then had the Polestar 2, which was basically an S40 sedan. We all knew that Volvo was planning on making an S40 sedan. It never actually happened. We got the XC90 and the C40 instead, but that sedan format, that turned into the Polestar 2, also thinly disguised as a Polestar. We then had the Polestar 3, that's the two-row EX90, further divorced from Volvo styling, but definitely very Volvo. Now we have the Polestar 4, and this is not Volvo at all. Nope, this sleek EV is the close relative of the Zeekr 001 or the Lotus Electra, although it shares more with the Zeekr than the Lotus. Zeekr is obviously not sold in the United States, but it is sold around the world, and this is a world car for Polestar, which is why it's manufactured in two different factories. It's manufactured primarily in China because, of course, logically, Polestar sells a decent volume in China, and it's also built in South Korea because they wanted to avoid some tariffs for the United States. Of course, that didn't work out exactly since there are tariffs on South Korea now. But this is actually built in a joint venture factory with Renault. So Renault Korea is now partially owned by Polestar, which is partially owned by Volvo. And again, a little bit on the confusing side. But importantly, this has zero Volvo DNA in it. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Let's check back at the end. Let's pause for a moment and talk pricing. When initially announced, the Polestar 4 was supposed to be more expensive than the Polestar 2, but that's not the case anymore. Thanks to a recent price drop, the 4 starts at $47,800, including destination, which is actually less than the 2024 Polestar 2. If you're confused, Polestar's going in numerical order from when the models were launched, not how big they are or how expensive they are, which is a little bit of a brain warp for me at least. The all-wheel drive trim, which we're looking at today, starts at $54,300, and this is nearly a base all-wheel drive model. How does that compare against the competition? Well, it depends on what you want to shop against this, but I would cross-shop an Ioniq 6 that starts at $39,995, but of course will get just about as expensive if you opt for that Ioniq 6N. The BMW i5 starts at $68,550, so this is significantly less than that. It's also significantly less than a Tesla Model S at $96,630, but really more expensive than the Model 3, which I think for a lot of people is actually a little bit more of a direct competitor, because it's certainly not Model Y. The 4 is the first Polestar built on a dedicated EV platform. Now, Polestar and Volvo argue that a bit with the EX90 and the Polestar 3, but those are very closely related to the SPA platform that the XC90, XC60, etc. are built upon. It was heavily modified for electric duty, but I have a problem calling it a dedicated electric vehicle platform. This, however, is undeniably 100% EV from the ground up, and very, very sleek at that. It actually looks a little bit like that Zeekr 1, if I'm honest. But the front-end design is definitely all Polestar, with the split headlight design here. The actual headlights, of course, are just down there in that lower module. This one is just part of the turn signal and the DRL. Both of these lines blink, of course, for the turn signal. Interestingly, this is the first Polestar without a radar sensor, well, without a lot of extra sensors that other Polestars have had, because this relies almost exclusively on cameras for the ADAS systems. There are 11 cameras all the way around, including 8 megapixel cameras in the front, out back, on the sides, etc. And those are providing adaptive cruise control, autonomous emergency braking, lane centering, all that functionality, rather than using a radar sensor like we find in the 1, 2, 3, and perhaps some of the other upcoming Polestars. Now, the cameras don't just replace the radar sensor, they also replace the rear window, something that I'm not the biggest fan of from an aesthetic standpoint, but also a functional standpoint. I'll talk about that in a bit. What is weird, though, for me at least visually, is the fact that they still have this seam line here, and they have a separate panel for where the rear window would have gone, just below this large rear brake light. Now, the cameras for the rear view mirror, those are right up there, and the camera for the 360 cam, that's down there just below the bumper. So we have lots of cameras absolutely everywhere. Obviously, one change from the Euro market model that I drove in Spain a while back is that we have a red turn signal here rather than an amber turn signal. I'm a little bit sad about that. I think this would have looked a little bit better with an amber turn signal in the rear. Now, as far as the style goes, again, I think this looks a little bit more sedan-like than SUV-like, but technically Polestar 4 calls this a coupe SUV. I don't know if I necessarily buy that. I also think that if they had put a piece of glass right here, it would still be more useful than nothing because there's also a little pass-through between the passenger area in the rear and that cargo area in the back. If I were to ever end up with a Polestar 4, I think the first thing that I would do would be wrap this little section right here in black, so that way at least visually it looked like a window. Versus the Polestar 2, the 4 is significantly longer, 190.5 inches from tip to tail, about 10 inches longer than the 2. And a lot of that goes to the interior. We get significantly more rear legroom, but of course we also have more room for a bigger battery pack. I'll talk more on that later because oddly, this platform supports an even bigger battery than we find in this particular model. Oddly in the lineup, this really is not that much smaller than the Polestar 3. It's only about 2.5 inches shorter, although the roofline is definitely very different. It's lower, it doesn't have the air suspension that we find in the 3, and it doesn't have that more hatchback-like profile in the rear. Cargo room, it's actually not too far off. In fact, the 4 and the 3 are really so close together in many ways that I don't understand why they both exist, at least for this market where sedans and sedan-shaped things are just not as popular as SUVs. Here are some of the extra cameras. We have one here that's looking down on the road, one here that's looking forward, and then one here that's looking back towards the side. Because again, the cameras are doing lane positioning, lane monitoring, the 360-degree camera system, blind spot monitoring, etc. All of that is being done by the onboard cameras. If that sounds Tesla-like, you're not wrong, it definitely does. If you want to call the 4 a coupe crossover, you do you, but I will point out that the roofline is only 0.8 of an inch lower to the ground than a BMW 5 Series. So again, for me, this is more passenger car than utility vehicle. Polestar won't say exactly how much of the 4's drivetrain is shared with the Zeekr 1, but I suspect based on the specs, which are suspiciously identical, that a reasonable amount is shared. The rear motor, 272 horsepower. In this model, we also have a front motor, producing the same 272 horsepower, bringing you up to that 544 total. 0 to 60 times, 3.7 seconds quoted by Polestar for this model, 6.9 seconds for the single motor model, so a reasonable amount slower. But you do get 30 miles of extra range compared to this model. What's odd, though, is that you cannot get, at least for the moment, the 140 kilowatt hour battery pack that you can theoretically get in that Zeekr. That would really be an interesting twist, because if I do the back of the napkin math here, that could have made this a 400-mile EV, and as it is, it's really more of a 300-mile EV. Now, speaking of 400s, this is a 400-volt nominal battery pack, not an 800-volt pack like we find in the Lotus Electra. That's definitely a big difference between its platform mate and the Polestar version. Charging times, though, pretty reasonable, 10% to 80% in 30 minutes, so basically the same as a Tesla Model S, which is logical because the battery pack is about the same size as the one that we find in the Model S. The button for the power hatch is right there above the Polestar logo, and behind that hatch we find 18.6 cubic feet of storage space, so a little bit more than the average luxury sedan, but not as much as a lot of SUVs, of course. We do have enough room for 4 of these 22-inch roller bags to line up right there against the rear seats, but I did have to remove this little divider. The rigid floor in the cargo area feels pretty sturdy, and it can be inserted in two different heights, one that's about 4 inches lower than the other, or you can remove it from the vehicle if you want the most storage space. This is a foam sound deadener right there, and then we have a deep cargo well where we find the charge port in this particular model, and of course the can of Fix-A-Flat. Up front, there's a little bit of additional storage space. This has a lid in a lid style front trunk, but it's pretty small, only about half a cubic foot. One of the reasons I mentioned pricing earlier is because I find the front seats unusual for something that's in the $50,000 price range, in that we don't have any adjustable lumbar support by default. You have to add the $5,500 plus pack in order to get that feature. And that's something I would really love to see standard, because the front seats, they're generally comfortable, but on a longer journey, I really want extra lumbar support, and that's what's going to keep this at a 6 out of 10 score for me. We do have the same range of motion on the passenger seat as the driver's seat, and if you get that plus pack, then front seat comfort goes up to 9 out of 10 points. It's a pretty significant jump because we get a lot of extra adjustability and comfort in that design. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a reasonable range of motion, and the front seat tracks do move a reasonable amount down and rearward, so if you have longer legs, you shouldn't have too much of a problem finding a good driving position. You can see that if this seat is all the way back there, I'm practically staring at that B pillar, and my legs are definitely a long way away from the pedals. But the seating position is very sedan-like, so they might call this a crossover or a coupe SUV, but height from the ground, my butt off the ground, as well as my seating position, it's very sedan-like. That goes for the rear seats as well, where this seating position is more like a 5 Series or an E-Class than an X5 or a GLE. My legs are stretched out more in front of me, and the seat back is a little bit more reclined as well. There's quite a bit of legroom here. Even though this front seat is moved further back than I would sit in a lot of vehicles because it really encourages that reclined position, I still have about 7 inches of room between my knees and that front seat back, meaning I had no problem fitting a rear-facing infant seat behind me. But oddly, the rear seats are significantly higher off the ground than the front seats. That really gives this a stadium seating vibe, and it reduces rear seat headroom effectively quite a lot. Versus the Polestar 3, we have about 2 inches less headroom in the back. For me, I have maybe about half an inch, 3/4 of an inch of room between my head and the glass roof, and my head's pretty close to the side right there. Let's move over to the middle and see how that goes. Whew, that is definitely even higher off the ground, and here my head is definitely touching the glass roof. Scooting all the way over to the right side, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" person sitting there. I still have, let's check it out here, looks like about 4 inches of room between my knees and that front seat back. So again, lots and lots of room back here. We also have a nearly flat floor. We do have a little bit of a bump probably for cables, but nothing major there. USB-C charge points, air vents in the back, and of course, rear seats that fold. We have a fold-down armrest with no storage. That's kind of a weird twist, but we do have cup holders that pop out of the front. Not the best cup holders, but they are there. And the rear seats fold in a 60/40 fashion to give you 54 cubic feet of total storage space. Before we move up front, let's take a closer look at some of the details back here. We have those air vents there, the USB-C charge points there, down there lower. We have a small knick-knack cubby. You can see the not quite flat floor there. The rear doors are finished in very similar upholstery and feature set to the front doors, with the ambient light strip running right there in the middle. And here's what that would look like if it actually had a rear window. You can see what's going on here. The glass roof goes to right there. We then have this really big dishy section right there, for lack of a better term for what that is. If I back out here, maybe you can see that a little bit better. And then we have this center headrest that definitely occupies a lot of space. So as far as rear window goes, that would certainly be in the way. But in the rearview mirror, you'd still get something out of that rear window, and I think something's better than nothing. This is the reason the rear window situation is a deal breaker for me. It's not the lack of window itself, it's the fact that the only solution is an LCD, and your eyes are focusing on the LCD itself, not on the image in the distance like you would with a mirror. Let's check this out for comparison. You'll notice those trees in the distance, those are blurry because the camera is focused here. If I adjust the camera to focus on those trees in the distance like my eyes would, then you'll notice that that is now blurry. And that's not how a regular mirror works. When you're looking at an image in the distance in this mirror, your eyes are focusing on that tree in the distance, not on the surface of the mirror. And that's why the things in the mirror and the things in the distance there are just about equally in focus. The older my eyes get, the more obvious this problem becomes, because if I'm wearing my glasses to drive like I usually do, it's actually kind of difficult to focus on something this close, and it is a lot closer than the LCD right there, or the LCD instrument cluster that's even further away. If you wear bifocals or progressives, it's going to be even trickier because you're really going to have to shift your vision up like that in order to really focus on that, and that's a little bit of a problem, especially bearing in mind that the average new car buyer is not exactly 20 years old. Moving up here, we find buttons for the telematics systems, the dome lights, etc. We find sun visors that do not extend or slide to the side. I think that's a bit of a misstep right there. And then we have this really big panoramic glass roof that's definitely become very typical in EVs. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and fixed in place head restraints for the front seats. Very attractive sort of sport style seat right there. I really appreciate the bolstering on the sides, but again, I would love it if we had standard adjustable lumbar support in these seats. I think that's definitely a misstep, because you do get significantly more comfortable seats if you choose that Plus pack. As you'd expect in a modern EV, these are not leather upholstered seats. These are made from an imitation leather, but you can get real Nappa leather if you want to. We have fabric inserts over there on the doors. We also have a pretty nice audio system in this model, even though this does not have the up-level audio system. I appreciate the fabric inserts over here on the dashboard and the sort of wetsuit texture trim on the top. It gives a different vibe versus some of the Naugahyde stuff that we find in so many vehicles out there. It took me a while, but I did find that glove compartment button. It's right over there, and we have a reasonably sized glove compartment that was able to fit a large tablet computer inside. Now, speaking of tablet computers, looks like we have a really big one grafted into the dashboard. This is a big horizontal screen here, and as you can see, it supports almost full screen Apple CarPlay. I really like that because this is a huge implementation of CarPlay, and if you want an EV that offers that particular feature, this is going to be one of the few out there that does that. I apologize for the screen refresh on the camera. It's obviously not flickering in person. We have the Google Mapping interface there with live data, of course, live charging information as well. We have downloadable apps in the system. You can do Sirius XM. So if you don't want apps for streaming, you can do that. You can, of course, do Spotify. We have YouTube there, Polestar Experience app, whole bunch of different downloadable apps as well. And a lot of controls, of course, in this software here for things like your mirrors, your steering wheel. Not the biggest fan of that. I would actually like some extra buttons, but it's more or less easy to find what you're after. Over here, we have the seat heating buttons. And if I dive into the climate control settings here, if I pop this up, we have the finger control air vents that Tesla has popularized as well. But you can also have them wander around. So if you press this button right here, they're slowly going to wander around to give you kind of a breezy feel. Down here we have that big central air vent, Qi wireless charging mat right there, a play pause button, and volume knob for the infotainment system. Lots of soft touch materials, but cup holders that are a little close together, I think, for American tastes. If you have larger takeout drinks, they're definitely going to be rubbing into one another. Below that, we have a large storage area right there with some rubber mats down there and some additional retention areas to help keep things from rolling around. Decently sized storage compartment right there with a USB interface and a USB charge only port. There is the Polestar Tesla charge adapter, obviously made by Tesla. It should be pretty familiar if you've seen that. That allows you to charge at a supercharger station. Now, moving over to the driver's side, we have another thing that you won't find in a lot of Teslas, but similar to the Model S, we have a separate display right there, which is nice because this actually supports two-screen Apple CarPlay mapping as well. So if you have your navigation in Apple Maps or Waze or Google Maps, it'll actually be showing up there, navigation from your smartphone, and you can change between a few different designs for that display. The steering wheel itself is a little bit different than the other Polestar wheels because this is obviously not based on the Volvo setup, so these menus and interactions are Polestar themed, but they don't exactly behave like the ones in the Polestar 3. We have the buttons for the adaptive cruise control over there on that side. These buttons relate mainly to changing the theme of that display and activating your trip information right there. You can also get a shortcut to adjust the mirrors right there in that display, which does make it a bit easier than digging around through the central display. Over here we have turn signals, of course, the auto high beam right there, and then your gear shift, that's on the stock on that side. As with many electric vehicles, Polestar offers an RFID key card to get in and start the car. There's also a phone app, but there's also a proximity key, which is definitely my preference, although this one has no buttons at all on it. So you simply get close to the vehicle, you can't open the trunk in advance of getting to the vehicle. All right, let's get the 4 out on the road, and when you romp on the throttle, you get a little bit of torque steer and a whole lot of acceleration, because this goes 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds. That's 1/10 of a second faster than the manufacturer estimate. I wouldn't be surprised if the rear-wheel drive model was a little bit quicker, but they could also deliberately be dumbing that down a bit just to help people get into the dual motor model. And if I were shopping for one, I would definitely get the dual motor one, because it's simply so much more fun and so much more playful out on the road. It's really surprising that this is as heavy as it is. This weighs nearly 5,200 pounds, 5,192 to be exact. That's 300 to 400 pounds heavier than a Tesla Model S. But because of the suspension design on this model, it actually feels, I think, a little bit lighter and a little bit more nimble than the Model S. Certainly not as light and nimble, though, as a Model 3. Definitely very different vibe. And that's what's kind of interesting in a way, is that Polestar kind of has a multiple personality disorder. The Polestar 1, 2, 3, 4, they all feel and drive very differently out on the road. This is perhaps the most normal EV, I guess you could say, in that it feels a lot like the Tesla lineup in the acceleration. If we romp on the throttle, the response is very instant. From a stop, it's almost neck-breaking the amount of torque you get out of this drivetrain. If I slow down here again and just romp on the throttle, you're instantly pressed back in the seat. You can really feel the traction control and those tires giving you the best acceleration possible. And they do a pretty decent job at the braking too. 115 feet from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's a pretty decent stopping distance considering the curb weight and the tire size. These are 255 width tires all the way around. It's a symmetrical tire setup. And this interestingly does not have the torque vectoring axle in the back that we find in a Polestar 3. Now, the Polestar 3 is kind of a weird one here because it's going to change character yet again when we get the new 800-volt pack next year, but for the moment, in a lot of driving situations, it's front-wheel drive, and it will actually disconnect the rear electric motor. But if you put it in the performance mode, then it keeps the rear motor engaged and can torque vector across the rear axle. This does not have that ability, so if I floor this in corners here, it feels very neutral, very stable, very Tesla dual motor-like. If you do the same in the Polestar 3, you can really feel that torque vectoring action in the rear, making it feel sort of like, I guess you'd say, a Model S Plaid, where it has that tri-motor setup, not quite as aggressive on the acceleration front, but it certainly has that ability to initiate a yaw motion in the back thanks to that torque vectoring axle in the rear. This has a different vibe to it. This feels a little bit less connected in some ways because the steering is even more isolated than we find in the Polestar 3. It really is quite video game-like. But the steering is also really quick, so on tighter roads like this, I found myself initially having to make corrections because the steering is so quick that I was turning just a little bit further than I needed to. This is a lot of fun out on roads like this, but it also feels just slightly video game-like in that disconnection and the fact that the body stays very, very stable and very planted. There's very little tip and dive, there's very little body roll, so if I romp on the throttle, if I stomp on the brake, if I wobble side to side, you notice that the body is really quite stable on this road. It's very confidence-inspiring, and it also kind of masks the curb weight, which is, again, nearly 5,200 pounds. When it comes to the handling ability, bearing in mind that handling is more than just the raw grip, it's also the feel, I'm going to give this an A- because I do find the steering a little bit too video game-like for my tastes, but I do like the quickness of the ratio. It makes driving on mountain roads like this really nice, and also the amount of grip that we have is really excellent. And the balance between handling and ride quality, I think, is absolutely spot on as well. When it comes to ride quality, I'm going to give this particular model an A-. It's a little bit firmer than some of those larger luxury sedans in the EV space, but it's really quite comfortable. Now, this one has the middle suspension setup. There are 3 different suspensions. There's a non-adaptive steel spring setup in the rear-wheel drive model. the dual motor model gets an adaptive damper configuration. That's what I'm driving right here, and it really does a good job of soaking up these larger bumps and imperfections. Some of those bumps are really quite deep, and this does a good job of not feeling firm and bouncy like a Tesla Model 3 or a Tesla Model Y often can. It actually feels a little bit more like the Tesla Model S in that respect. And then if you get the performance pack that has the more aggressive suspension tune, I think that might be just a little bit firm for my tastes. I was able to spend some time in that thanks to a local dealer, but not exactly to my taste. If you get your Polestar 4 with the performance pack, then you get a performance tuned suspension with Öhlins dampers, and that's definitely going to be firmer than the model that I'm driving here, but a bit more suitable for canyon carving like the road that I'm on now. In our cabin noise testing, we measured 61.2 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, putting this right in the thick of things as far as the luxury competition goes. Fuel efficiency also has been right in the thick of things. 3.2 to 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour is what we've been averaging. So if you treat this gently, you could easily get over 300 miles of range in the dual motor model. I have to admit, this is more efficient than I had expected it to be, and we've been driving it pretty aggressively over the week that we've had it. One thing that I really like is that in addition to the two-mode one-pedal driving, we also have a pure sailing mode. If I turn the one-pedal drive off, we don't get any throttle lift-off recuperation. Of course, this still has blended braking, so if I put my foot on the brake pedal, I still get a lot of aggressive regen. And Polestar has been really aggressive at their brake regeneration. You actually have to be really aggressive on this before you engage the friction brakes, or you have to be driving really slowly. So Polestar is being pretty aggressive at regenerating as much energy back into the battery as possible, but also allowing you that really efficient pure sailing mode where we're basically in neutral. That is, generally speaking, more efficient than one-pedal driving. So if you want to eke out the most out of your battery on those longer distance road trips, and you want to have that really long following distance between you and the car in front of you, you can really make the most out of your electrons.
If you thought talking about pricing would make the Polestar 4 a little bit less confusing, hold on to your hats because I'm not really sure that it does. Theoretically, right now, it starts at $46,400 plus destination brings you up to $47,800. That is $10,000 off the regular base MSRP. Now, Polestar says this is a limited time deal, but it's been running for quite some time. And honestly, I don't expect it to really change because pricing on EVs has generally been affected by the lack of tax credit and the increased pressure on tariffs and sales, etc. So I don't really think that Polestar could afford to put the price back up, even if it means potentially selling the Polestar 4 at maybe a little bit of a book loss because of the tariffs, etc. If you want the all-wheel drive model, that's $52,900. Both of those get a standard adaptive suspension system. One option that I would get in the Polestar 4 that I appreciate, and we don't find in a lot of the competition, is the electrochromatic roof. It's a $1,500 must-have in my opinion. It really does block a lot more light than I had expected it to coming down from the ceiling without the worry of those flip-in shades that do reduce headroom a bit. The performance pack, I think I would probably skip it, honestly, unless you really wanted the brakes and the orange accents, because it's basically brakes, wheels, orange accents, and a slightly retuned adaptive suspension system. For $4,500, it's a pretty decent ask. Now, on the other hand, the Plus pack for $5,500, I think I probably would get that because you get the power hatch, the head-up display, the Harman Kardon audio system, which is a solid upgrade over the base one. We get auto-dimming side view mirrors. I think that's important since you're going to be needing them with the lack of that rear window. And you get the more comfortable and more adjustable front seats. Something that, again, I think is weirdly missing on a vehicle with this kind of a base price tag. You also get heated rear seats and a power second row recline, kind of a nice touch, and 3-zone automatic climate control as well. The leather seating, that's a pretty spendy $3,700 option. I'm not entirely clear whether I would get it, although I have to admit I do like the leather seats in the Polestar 4 if you choose that option. And of course, if you get carried away with all the options, you'll end up at $73,500 in your Polestar 4 dual motor. Now, what is the Polestar 4? That's a tricky thing, of course, because it's not quite a sedan, definitely not an SUV. So comparisons are a little bit unusual. It's operating in this mid-size segment in the sedan, well, really sedan market, where we don't see an awful lot of traction, and as a result, somewhat reduced competition, because Tesla has famously decided to exit this segment. They've killed off the S and they've killed off the X as well. So the probably closest competitor, I would say, from a mainline manufacturer is going to be something like a BMW i5. Although that's not exactly the closest either, since it does start more expensive at $67,100. The i5's efficiency has been very good, and I think the interior is really quite comfortable as well. But like BMW's i4, which I guess we should move over to now, the i4 and i5 are both based on regular gasoline vehicle platforms. The i5 is logically the 5 Series, the i4 is logically the 4 Series Grand Coupe, and as a result, the interior is compromised in ways that the Polestar 4 is not, because it's a dedicated EV platform vehicle. There is a pretty decent transmission tunnel and a pretty reasonable hump in the back of the 4 and the 5 from BMW, and that does affect interior practicality as well. On the other hand, BMW spent a lot of cash where I think it's important. The battery technology, so charging is reasonably good, and the motors, so efficiency is very high in BMW's latest EVs. Really impressively high in the i4, I have to say. We were definitely impressed with the road trip range in that vehicle. Now, interior space and cargo space, etc., is definitely compromised, which is why the Polestar 4 is really more i5 sized, I would say, than i4 sized. Even though the i4 is priced, I guess, closer to the Polestar 4, still a bit more expensive, but a little bit closer. Now, with the Model S dead, let's move on to the Model 3. The Model 3 is decently less expensive. It's about $8,000 less, starting at $38,630 currently. Now, if you believe Tesla, of course, with their marketing literature on gas savings, etc., that's all going to apply to any of the other EVs that we talk about, so you should make the same reductions. The big thing, of course, the Model 3 has going for it is native Tesla supercharger access to the entire supercharger network, not just the limited group that's available to everybody else, including the Polestar 4, and the promise of full self-driving in air quotes, depending on exactly how you feel about that particular subscription feature. It is getting a little pricey, and of course there has been, some concern about exactly how good full self-driving is with some of the accident claims that are coming out now, and Tesla's particular decision to be very aggressive at allowing full self-driving to drive in situations with limited visibility and maybe questionable decision sets around that, where it's really pushing the driver to be making those decisions. At any rate, I will leave that part up to you. The Polestar 4 feels better put together. It feels more luxurious, more premium on the inside. We also get features like the electrochromatic roof. We get an instrument cluster where you'd expect an instrument cluster to be. And in some ways, it's slightly more traditional, even though it was clearly designed as an all-electric modern EV platform from the ground up, with certainly some similarities in the fact that we get that entirely vision-based autonomous safety system, very much like we find in modern Teslas. It's just that Polestar and their parent company haven't really been pushing towards the same levels of autonomy that we find from Tesla. There were some rumors, of course, that we would get the latest in autonomous driving from the Mobileye stuff that's going on in the Polestar 4, but that has yet to materialize. The lack of that feature, which appears to be Mobileye's chauffeur feature with a LiDAR sensor from Luminar, has fallen apart probably because of the lack of LiDAR sensor from Luminar. Looks like Volvo and Polestar have ended that relationship, and that's probably why we don't have that feature at this point in time. Now, how about the close relative of the Polestar 4? Well, we don't get this in the United States, but we do need to talk about the Zeekr 1. Because what's missing in the Polestar 4 that I think would have been a breakaway feature is the Zeekr's 140 kilowatt hour battery pack. Not only is that battery pack bigger, but the Zeekr 001 with that battery pack has some fantastic efficiency numbers and some truly impressive charging. It's using a new battery pack design from CATL that's promising 10% to 80% charging in 11 minutes. And actually, I shouldn't say promising, because you can actually do that in China in that vehicle. And with that 140 kilowatt hour battery pack in the Zeekr, you can go a real world 536 miles at 74 miles an hour. This is not the quote from Zeekr. They're quoting way longer than that on the Chinese test cycle. This is the number delivered by actual real world tests in the Zeekr 1. That is a truly impressive range number, and if they could stuff that into the Polestar 4, it would be a game changer, because it would be the only direct competition to the extreme range versions of the Lucid Air. And based on the price tag in the Polestar 4, even if you add 40% to the battery pack cost, we're still talking about a vehicle that could be a lot less expensive than the Lucid Air. And when you put that in perspective, it would also be one of the few new vehicles that could approach gasoline vehicle-like recharging times. 11 minutes, 375 miles of range gained. That's a truly impressive charging statistic. If you wanted to stop for just 5 minutes like you would for gas, you could easily get more than 200 miles of driving range, which in the US is solidly going to be 3 to 4 hours of real-world driving before you might want to stop again and plug in for just another 5 minutes. It's a very impressive statistic. Sadly, though, we do not get that in the United States. Now, moving on, I think the bigger problem for the Polestar 4 is that Polestar 3 right there on the dealer lot, which is only about $3,000 more than the Polestar 4. Let's talk about the differences between these two vehicles. The 4 is again the close relative of the Zeekr. It's a dedicated EV platform. The Polestar 3, Polestar likes to say it's a dedicated EV platform, but it is in fact a heavily massaged platform borrowed from the XC90 used in the EX90 and the Polestar 3, the SPA2 platform essentially. Now, the next generation of this platform used under the EX60, Volvo's new smaller EV, that appears to be even further divorced from the gasoline vehicles, but there is a reasonable amount shared between 3 and XC90 and EX90, etc. They did a lot of substantial changes, of course, for electrification, but there's certainly some structure here and there that is borrowed from the other vehicles. That makes it more EV than something like a BMW i4 or an i5, but maybe a little bit less dedicated than a Polestar 4 would be. There are obviously some pros and cons there. The big pro for the Polestar 3 is that it feels very Volvo on the inside. At least for me, that's definitely a pro. I like the build quality, I like the parts quality, and just the look and feel of everything feels very substantial, very normal luxury car segment. Now, not everybody's going to be a big fan of this, but it also drives like a more substantial vehicle, probably because of that relationship and the relatively high curb weight of the Polestar 3. You lose the adaptive suspension system in the long-range single-motor model, so if you want a simpler setup, you want to go that direction, but you gain an air suspension if you choose the dual-motor model, which would be my preference, because the ride quality is definitely better. I really like the way the Polestar 3 drives and rides, especially the current dual motor model with the interesting torque vectoring setup in the back. Now, this is really a weird twist because Polestar 3 is about to lose that trick rear axle, and I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that. The Polestar 3 rear axle has a rear axle disconnect. That's the origin of this feature. It has clutch packs on the outside of the differential unit so you can basically disconnect the rear wheels from the motor and improve efficiency. On the highway, it'd be front wheel drive. That makes a lot of sense because you get better regen braking potential on the front. Well, Polestar decided to throw that out the window, so soon we're going to be getting a brand new battery pack and brand new electric motors to improve 0 to 60 performance, because the Polestar 3 is decently slower than the Polestar 4, likely due to the weight and just the motor design, etc. But that's about to change. It's not going to get as fast as the 4 still, but it is going to get substantially faster with up to 670 horsepower, new electric motors, a brand new 800-volt battery pack, and subsystems as well. That's promising 22-minute 10% to 80% charging, so not as fast as that Zeekr in China still, but solidly competitive in North America with some of the faster charging EVs out there. And that 0 to 60 improvement is important. But to get there, they're putting new motors in the front and back, and now it's going to be the front motor that disconnects on the highway. The back motor is not going to get the torque vectoring function, which is really noticeable out on a winding mountain road. So I'm curious to see exactly how that goes. Bottom line for the 4, it's kind of an odd duck in an odd middle segment here. It's not quite as big and as roomy on the inside, especially as something like a Lucid Air, but it's not quite as affordable and practical as the Tesla Model 3. It's $8,000 more. Now, is it $8,000 more car? Maybe, depending on exactly how you value some of those features, but it is still a reasonable difference in MSRP. But I think importantly, it's also only a little bit less expensive than the Polestar 3, which is roomier, and I think feels more traditional luxury segment. If you're really interested in that fully tech-forward vehicle, that is the Polestar 4, with the screen format and the software design of that vehicle and the promise maybe of better features coming in the future with that vision-based system. But if you're looking for more of a traditional luxury vehicle, which I suspect some Polestar shoppers maybe are looking for a bridge between these two worlds, that would be the Polestar 3, which has also actually just received a pretty significant software and hardware update to the infotainment systems. So if you're wanting to buy something now, there is this weird middle ground where Polestar 3 has received already the infotainment hardware upgrades there with the faster processor and better software, etc. And then shortly it's going to be getting the new hardware, the new 800-volt battery pack and motors. Don't know exactly why they went in that direction. And then, of course, if you're looking for a 3-row version, that would be the EX90, which is also getting those same upgrades from the future Polestar 3. Anyway, let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below, and what is the best competitor to a Polestar 4, and what do you really think about that rear window situation? See all of you later.